Tonight, we travel into the dark heart of Appalachia, a place where the earth remembers every lie, and some prayers are better left unanswered. Drop your location in the comments, because as you watch, you'll learn why this story was buried deeper than any coal vein, and why someone wanted it to stay that way. Deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where fog moves like a living thing and hollers swallow sound, there stands a church time forgot. Its roof sags under the weight of 100 winters, and sunlight filters through broken panes in narrow, trembling beams. Inside, the air hangs thick with mildew and memory. The pews are warped, their edges carved with strange symbols that look more like warnings than worship. And if you listen long enough, some say you can still hear voices rising from beneath the floorboards, murmurs of a congregation that vanished long before the last sermon was preached. This place wasn't lost to nature. It was abandoned in fear. A century ago, it belonged to a community unlike any other, part church, part commune, part secret society. They called themselves the Gathered, but locals knew them by another name, the Mountain's Children. On paper, they were a religious movement devoted to purifying the soul through isolation and revelation. But stories whispered in nearby towns told of rituals held at night, of followers disappearing into caves beneath the ridge, and of a preacher whose promises of salvation turned into something far more sinister. Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on this forgotten cult, one buried beneath decades of silence, sealed case files, and superstition. We'll follow the trail of clues that survived, faded letters, fragments of official reports, and the testimony of those who still carry its scars. Some of what we'll uncover has never been made public before. The Appalachians are vast and beautiful, a land of rivers and ridges, resilience and faith. But beauty can hide darkness, and faith, in the wrong hands, can burn brighter than any wildfire. What compels ordinary people to surrender their will, their homes, even their families, to a man who claims to speak for God? What promises could draw them so deep into the mountain's shadow that they never came back out? This isn't just another tale of cult devotion gone wrong. It's a glimpse into how belief, fear, and isolation can twist together in the most remote corners of America, and how the echoes of that darkness still resonate through the hills today. Stay with me. The deeper we go, the stranger and truer this story becomes. The Appalachian Mountains stretch like the spine of an old god, running unbroken and brooding through the heart of the American East, enormous, ancient, and alive with whispers. They've been called many things: beautiful, unforgiving, sacred. To those who've carved their lives into these slopes, the mountains are both cradle and cage. Roads twist so tightly between ridges that a 10-mile drive can take an hour, and winter storms can close off a valley for weeks. Communication fades, and when the outside world stops coming around, people learn to rely on each other or on something older and more mysterious than community alone. Long before preachers and prospectors arrived, these ridges were already regarded as holy ground. Indigenous stories spoke of spirits that dwelled in the mountain's heartskeepers, of secrets buried in the stone. Later, when settlers came with their axes, they brought the Bible, but many held on to the old superstitions too. They built altars in their barns and whispered prayers over wells. Faith here was never simple. It was braided together with fear, nature, and the relentless test of endurance taught by the early 1900s. When the mining boom swept through, the hills transformed again. Coal camps sprang up, overnight rows of rough-planked homes clinging to ravines, lit by the dim glow of lanterns. The mines promised work, but at a cost. Men went underground before dawn and came back coated in soot, coughing black dust into their children's faces. The land that fed them now swallowed them whole. It didn't take long for some to wonder if something in the mountains demanded sacrifice. That's how isolation deepened into a kind of spiritual pressure. Churches multiplied, often only a mile apart, each convinced it held the only truth that could save souls perched between heaven and hell. In one holler, you might hear jubilant hymns. In the next, someone was handling snakes or speaking in tongues. A mile farther on, someone else was warning that both sides had gone astray. The mountains listened to all voices, but rarely answered back that it's in this blend of desperation, devotion, and distance that movements like the Gathered took root. The geography itself made secrecy possible. When a preacher rose and claimed he'd been shown a revelation in a dream, few could challenge him. Who would trek 5 hours through switchbacks and ravines to disagree? And when someone built a chapel on a ridge that even maps forgot, neighbors shrugged. It wasn't unusual for folks to vanish from regular church-going. They'd say, Old Crow found some folks willing to listen, and let the forest keep its own counsel. The beauty of this land is deceptive. The streams shimmer, and the air smells sweet with blooming laurel. But underneath lies a labyrinth of caves and abandoned tunnels, perfect hiding places for more than coal. The same underground veins that once bled black wealth later carried whispers, that the Gathered used them for rituals, that their preacher claimed the mountain itself spoke God's will through the earth's tremors. Whether truth or folklore, the setting made it believable. Here, nature teaches that everything hidden eventually resurfaces: a spring from a cave, a body from a flood, a story from silence. For generations, families learned to guard what they knew because survival depended on discretion. That instinct never left. Secrets, like minerals, run deep in these hills. So when townsfolk heard strange singing radiating through the valley one fog-thick night and saw torchlight flickering near the ridge, they didn't call the sheriff. They simply closed their curtains. The mountain, the story of the Gathered, had always kept its secrets, and the people who lived along its slopes in the late 1930s to do the same. When most of the country was clawing its way out of the Great Depression, Crow wandered into the mining town of Briar Hollow, carrying nothing but a Bible, a fiddle, and a voice that could grip a man's conscience like a vice. He wasn't the first outsider to step off the train looking for purpose, but there was something about him that made people listen. He spoke softly, but when his eyes fixed on you, it felt like he saw things you didn't want seen. Briar Hollow was the kind of place that had been forgotten by the country's recovery. The mine had closed 2 winters earlier after a collapse killed 22 men, leaving widows and children to feed themselves on scraps and promises. The soil was rocky, the scrip worthless, and the only sound most nights was the wind wailing through abandoned shafts. That's when Crow appeared, a man who claimed to have walked from Tennessee, guided by divine vision, saying the Lord had chosen the mountain above Briar Hollow as a place of refuge from the judgment to come. At first, he preached revival. He rented an old tobacco barn and turned it into what he called a meeting house. Folks came curious, maybe just for the music. Crow played that fiddle until the notes felt alive. He blended the familiar rhythm of mountain hymns with words that carried just enough mystery to catch in your chest. He talked about cleansing through labor, about a remnant that would survive the fire from heaven. He told them that the world had strayed, that the government's reach was proof of prophecy, that outsiders had defiled the land, and that only those who returned to pure faith, as he defined it, would be spared. This wasn't new talk in those parts. People distrusted Washington and preferred the wisdom of their grandfathers to any politician's promise. But Crow's sermon had a strange electricity. He mixed scripture with local superstition, quoting the Revelations one moment and Appalachian ghost tales the next, until the line between biblical vision and folklore blurred. Listeners found themselves nodding along to ideas that should have sounded outlandish, that heaven might not descend from above, but rise from within the earth. That salvation could be unearthed like coal. By the winter of 1938, Crow had gathered a devoted circle. They came from the edges of town, out-of-work miners, widows, and those the church no longer welcomed. He offered them belonging, and more importantly, meaning. He called his followers the gathered, claiming God told him they would rebuild a true faith before the end of days. Together, they cleared land on the mountainside, laying timbers for a church of their own. It was said Crow chose the site after spending 3 days alone in a nearby cave where he claimed to have received a revelation. The mountain, he declared, had spoken to him. No one pressed for details, but locals whispered about what he'd heard. Some said his voice changed after those 3 days, his sermons veering darker. He spoke of tunnels beneath the ridge, breathed into being before humankind, places where the light of the first fire still burns. He described hearing a humming deep in the stone, calling it the voice of creation. Those who doubted him were invited to pray in the cave themselves. Few accepted the offer. Those who did returned shaken, unwilling to talk about what they'd seen or said they'd seen. Over time, Crow's teachings evolved. He forbade his followers from depending on outsiders or the government. He told them that sickness and poverty were punishments for disbelief, that true believers needed nothing from the world beyond the mountain. Families began moving closer to the church, building shacks and gardens on what he called sanctified ground. He encouraged marriages within the group, baptized children in the icy creek at midnight, and taught that the Holy Spirit could inhabit the earth itself. The movement spread slowly, but its grip tightened. People who once doubted started selling what little they had to join. The old townspeople shook their heads, but didn't intervene after all. It wasn't the first time revival had gone strange in Appalachia, but this one had a secretive air, a quiet confidence that set it apart. Crow started referring to the work beneath, alluding to preparations for some grand unveiling. His sermons became filled with numbers and riddles, sevens carved in ash, psalms recited backward, and talk of descending before ascending. Then came the night of the first collapse. A small earthquake rattled Briar Hollow. In 1941, nothing unusual for mining country, but the next morning, Crow told his followers it was a sign. The Lord had shaken the world to reveal his chosen place. That same month, several men began tunneling beneath the church, claiming to follow Crow's instructions. No one outside the group knew what they were building. Some said they were expanding the basement to store food for the coming tribulation. Others whispered Crow wanted to find the source of that unearthly hum he described years before. Crow never wrote down his revelations, at least none that survived. But after his disappearance, investigators would find a single fragment of parchment sealed in wax, signed by his hand. On it were just 5 words. The voice is almost ready. What began as comfort for the desperate had turned into devotion bound by mystery. Whether Crow was a prophet, a manipulator, or merely a man who lost his mind in the dark remains uncertain. What is certain is this: in a town starved for hope, he offered belonging, purpose, and prophecy, and in return, people gave him everything they had, including their trust. The mountain, as always, kept the rest. By the mid-1940s, the gatherings on the mountain had grown from humble prayer meetings into something far more structured and far more secretive. Crow's sermons stopped being gentle stories about endurance and redemption. They hardened into commandments. He called them the 13 bindings, a code written, he said, under divine dictation during his nights alone in the tunnels. Followers began carrying small copies inked by hand, wrapped in cloth, and treated like scripture. Each binding outlined a renunciation of the world beyond the valley, of the false tongues of outside pastors, of money, of government, and even of kin who refused to call. The language Crow used was soothing but absolute. He didn't scream or threaten. He sang his lessons. His voice would rise and fall like a hymn, promising peace to those who obeyed, warning softly of the still darkness awaiting those who didn't. He spoke often about purity, which to him meant cleansing the soul of doubt. The only way to do that, he said, was through ritual. Prayer alone was too shallow. Faith had to be tested in body and bone. What began as long fasts and quiet prayers soon turned into nightly vigils. Followers would hike up to the ridge after sunset, each carrying a homemade torch dipped in pig fat. They wore simple linen clothes and tied woven cords, bands of loyalty, around their wrists. Former members later described standing in circles around Crow as he drew symbols in the dirt, spirals filled with 7 marks, repeated in outward rings. He would recite psalms backward until the fire sputtered, then fall silent. In that hush, people swore they heard the ground tremble, as if something below had stirred in answer. Crow taught that the mountain itself was alive, not metaphorically, but truly breathing, like a sleeping giant whose dreams sustained their faith. To keep it dreaming kindly, the gathered performed what they called harmony offerings. These were ritual devotions to feed the hollow, though no one outside the inner circle knew exactly what that entailed. Some said it was a form of collective prayer. Others whispered that it required something more tangible, a tithe that went beyond coin or crop. Life in the community tightened. New rules appeared monthly. No one could leave without permission. Outside letters were burned unopened. Music unapproved by Crow was forbidden. Even children learned to distinguish clean talk from world talk. There was even a rule about gaze. Eyes were to stay low when walking the valley paths, so as not to invite envy from the mountain's unseen guardians. Those who broke the rules were not beaten. They were isolated. Elder members would take them into one of the disused mine shafts and leave them with a lantern and a Bible until they heard correction. One woman who later escaped recalled her husband spending 2 nights underground after speaking against a decision. When he returned, she said, something had drained out of him. He smiled, but it wasn't his smile anymore. Children of the gathered grew up thinking this was normal. Many couldn't read beyond scripture, since formal schooling was seen as a corruption of faith. They were taught to repeat the 9 phrases of thanks each morning: gratitude for breath, soil, flame, and the word beneath. Outsiders occasionally spotted processions through the trees, lines of robed figures carrying jars of clay marked with a spiral and a cross. Anyone brave enough to watch too closely risked being chased off by sentries carrying pitchforks. Yet, despite the control, life among the gathered wasn't all fear. Within their camp, people described a strange peace. Meals were shared, singing filled the evenings, and there was a genuine sense of family. Widows were cared for, orphans given homes. Their self-sufficiency gardens, carpentry, herbal medicine made the group seem almost idyllic to nearby farmers, who only half believed the darker rumors. That contrast may have been what allowed them to endure so long. To some, they appeared holy. To others, quietly menacing. Crow's influence expanded as his promises grew bolder. He began speaking of an approaching revelation a day when the mountain would open, and the faithful would descend into its heart to witness the rebirth of the world. We are not waiting for heaven, he preached. Heaven is waiting for us. Members started calling themselves the Keepers of the Deep Light. They built new chambers beneath the church, accessible only to initiates. The entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the baptistry, camouflaged by stacked firewood. No outsider ever saw what lay beyond, but former members described the initiation. New recruits were led down by torchlight, past timbers still dotted with coal dust, until they reached a cavern lined with symbols daubed in white clay. There, they knelt in the dark. The air was thick and warm. They said Crow would chant a single syllable over and over, run, until the echoes blurred into an unbroken hum. Then came a moment of perfect silence, when even the dripping water stopped. That, he told them, was the voice of God breathing in. When they next opened their eyes, their torches seemed brighter, as though fed by something unseen. It was a simple trick of perception, surely, but to those who believed, it was proof of miracles. Recruits came from farther away as word spread. A few traveled from Georgia, others from Western Virginia, men and women seeking meaning after the war. Some arrived skeptical, yet stayed after witnessing what they called signs. One family claimed their child's fever broke the moment Crow prayed over her. Another swore a dead orchard blossomed after he sprinkled its soil with mountain salts. Skeptics dismissed these as coincidence. But to weary hearts, they felt divine. By 1950, the gathered had become a world unto itself. Members handed over property deeds to Crow and took vows of separation. Outsiders were shunned entirely. Even family visits had to be approved. When a cousin from Knoxville tried to retrieve his teenage sister, he was met by a dozen men standing silent with axes resting on their shoulders. He left and never came back. And yet the cult survived without open conflict, because the mountain gave them cover, and because, truth be told, most neighbors preferred not to know what was happening up there. Only later would the stories of the final rite emerge, pieced together from whispers and fragments of diaries. For years, found in the ruins, the gathered were treated as said to be a ceremony held once every 7 years, backwoods pocket, the one ritual no outsider had ever witnessed, and lived. Folks in Briar Hollow chuckled about Crow's Choir, as they called it, and swapped stories over coffee about their midnight songs drifting down the valley. But somewhere between laughter and unease, the talk began to change. The jokes faded first. Then the windows facing the ridge stayed shut after dark. The local paper, the Briar Hollow Courier, ran its first mention of the group in 1947. Just a few lines buried on page 4. Mountain sect holds extended prayer revival. Neighbors report strange hymns after midnight. The editor, Henry Tall, later told a visiting journalist he thought it harmless fun, like one of them tent revivals. Just longer. By the time a second article appeared that fall, his tone had shifted. Ranchers complain of missing livestock sect, blamed after symbols found near carcasses. Those symbols matched the ones carved into the old church's door spirals with 7 outer marks. Sheriff's deputies hiked up to question Crow, but they came back empty-handed and oddly subdued. One deputy, years later, admitted that the preacher's calm unsettled him. "He looked right through me," he said, "told me every creature that left the earth had been offered with blessing, and somehow I believed he meant it kindly." The reports stopped after that visit, not because the disappearances ended, but because folks decided it was safer to keep their mouths shut. Still, rumors found their own way down the hill. A miner's wife swore she saw lights flicker in the forest at 2 in the morning, glowing blue, like fireflies too big to be real. A group of boys claimed they stumbled on a circle of burned trees near an abandoned shaft. The ground covered in spotless bones, sheep, maybe dogs. No one wanted to check. A retired mail carrier remembered hearing hymns carried on the wind that seemed to shift in pitch, like the voices were echoing from inside the earth. Old-timers tried to explain it away. "People been hearing things up there since before Crow," they'd say. Mountain plays tricks on sound. Others, particularly churchgoers, insisted it was proof the devil had finally settled on Briar Hollow. Wednesday prayer meetings started including extra pleas for protection. The Methodist minister even preached a sermon titled, "Beware the False Shepherds." A week later, his barn burned to the ground. By 1949, fear outpaced curiosity. Families living on the outskirts quietly sold land and moved closer to town. Children were forbidden to wander past the creek. The county refused to deliver mail beyond a certain point, claiming the road was too poor to maintain, though locals whispered that even postal trucks weren't safe up there. It was as if an invisible border had been drawn. That ridge belongs to them, and the rest of us to ourselves. Despite the whispers, law still hesitated to act. Crow's people paid taxes, kept to themselves, and caused no provable harm. Until one spring evening changed everything. It began with a missing girl, 14-year-old Ruthie Connors, daughter of a man who hauled timber out of the hauler. She'd been seen the previous Sunday walking with two women from Crow's camp, their arms full of wildflowers. When she didn't come home, her father searched the trails until dawn and finally went to the sheriff. A search party combed the ridge for 3 days. They found a dress ribbon snagged on a blackberry bush. Then nothing. The Courier broke the story on May 12, 1949, under the headline, "Child Lost in Mountain Woods Local Sect Assisting Search." The article described how Crow himself joined the effort, guiding lawmen through trails few outsiders could navigate. When asked about Ruthie, he said gently, "The lamb has chosen her flock." If anyone pressed, he only smiled. That statement never made it to print. It was cut from the final edition. After that, the town's relationship with the sect shifted from wary tolerance to quiet dread. Farmers began nailing crosses above barn doors. Women carried sprigs of rosemary in their pockets to keep the dark from sticking. A new saying spread: "Don't look toward Crow's Hill when the moon's low, it might look back." Years later, oral histories conflicted on what happened next. Some swore the authorities attempted a raid and were turned back by a storm that arrived out of nowhere. Others said the sheriff's own nephew had joined the gathered and convinced them to delay. Whatever the truth, no official action was taken for months. Then, in the autumn of 1950, smoke rose from the ridge, black, thick, and greasy. By morning, half the church compound was gone, and Elias Crow was nowhere to be found. That fire was the first time Briar Hollow truly believed the mountain meant harm. It was also the last time anyone tried to climb it without a weapon. But before flames and ashes came investigations, and before investigations came a wave of silence zones that still hang heavy in the hollers to this day. What the townsfolk discovered in the aftermath made even the skeptics afraid to speak the preacher's name aloud. No one agreed on what first drew attention to the mountain that night: the column of smoke twisting into the frozen air, or the sound that came before it. Some said it was thunder, though the sky was clear. Others swore it was singing, a wordless harmony that rose in pitch until it cracked like glass, followed by a deep rumble rolling through the holler. Whatever it was, it carried for miles, waking dogs and scattering flocks of crows. By dawn, the ridge above Briar Hollow was burning. The fire spread fast. Witnesses at the county line reported seeing flames licking 30 feet high, bright enough to cast shadows on their barns nearly a mile away. The sheriff's office didn't reach the site until mid-morning. What they found looked less like a wildfire and more like a battlefield. The church compound 3 main cabins, a communal hall, and the sanctum built into the hillside was reduced to blackened ribs of timber. Smoke still hissed from cracks in the frozen ground. Of the several dozen members known to live there, only a handful were accounted for. Most were dead, and a few simply gone. Elias Crow was one of the missing. Officially, the report listed accidental combustion from lantern fuel, but photographs taken that morning tell a different story. Windows shattered outward, not inward. The fire had jumped irregularly, skipping whole sections of wall while reducing stone pillars to lime. One investigator noted the absence of a single metal hinge, as if, he wrote, they'd melted clean off and run downhill. The survivors couldn't or wouldn't explain. They were found barefoot on the trail below the compound, their clothes unburned but streaked with ash. When questioned, each told a version of the same story, that they'd been ordered out of the sanctuary midway through a rebirth gathering. Crow had sent them to pray on the ridge while he and a chosen few entered the deep light. Moments later, they saw the mountain shiver with flame. Mary Ellen Grady, one of the youngest survivors, told the Courier, "It was like fire coming from the ground, not down from the sky. We heard him laughing, then we didn't hear anything." She was 17. Decades later, she still refused to set foot near the ridge. Other reports blurred witness and legend. A logger working the next hollow claimed to see figures outlined in the blaze-white shapes moving through the inferno, hands raised. Another man, a miner named Tiller, swore he saw the earth split just below the baptistry wall, a flash of blue fire roaring up out of it like the devil's carbide lamp. But when investigators inspected the area, all they found was a sinkhole radiating heat days after the flames died. Geological survey teams chalked it up to subterranean coal veins igniting common enough in mining country. Locals weren't convinced. "Coal burns red," one old miner said. That night was blue. The county brought in outside help, a fire marshal from Charleston, a pair of federal agents said to have connections with the Bureau of Mines, and a representative from the state health department. For 3 days, they sifted through cinders. Their findings were never fully released, but fragments surfaced later through an anonymous source. They described multiple burn origins and unidentified residue within the foundation stone. The residue was crystalline, not organic, and glowed faintly when warmed. After those notes leaked, the file was sealed. Within a week, the survivors dispersed. Some went north to family. Others disappeared completely, changing names or leaving the state. The property was condemned, though no one ever filed for ownership, and the church ruins were left to rot. The sheriff, who oversaw the investigation, retired early. When a reporter tracked him down years later, he only said, "If you could have seen what their eyes looked like, you wouldn't ask questions." Of all the stories lingering from that night, one refuses to fade. In the center of the compound, beneath what had been the altar, investigators found a hollow chamber, blackened, airtight, and sealed by a slab of marble inscribed with Crow's symbol, the spiral of 7 marks. Inside were 6 bodies arranged in a ring, their hands clasped, their faces serene. And in the center of that ring lay a 7th shape entirely consumed, leaving only the imprint of a body in ash. No remains were ever identified as Elias Crow's. Fire has a way of cleansing evidence, yet it also exposes what was meant to stay hidden. Among the ruins, a deputy discovered a metal folio half buried in soot. Inside were pages fused together, illegible, but for a single line still visible across one edge. Written in Crow's unmistakable hand, "When stone remembers, the light will rise." The page was tagged as Exhibit D, and then quietly relocated to Charleston's archives. Years later, when researchers sought to examine it, they were told it no longer existed. To this day, no definitive cause of the fire has been proven. Some insist it was arson, perhaps, by townsfolk fed up with the cult's strangeness, or by Crow himself in one final act of madness. Others believe it was the inevitable end of dangerous ritual, a communion gone terribly wrong. The more superstitious mutter that the preacher got exactly what he wanted, that he descended into the mountain's heart and never returned. But one detail in the wreckage didn't match any known cause. For a few brief weeks after the fire, marble slab, it seemed like the world into the finally learn what investigators found. A patch of glassy stone. Reporters poured into Briar Hollow. When struck with a fled a field photographer, rang clear as a bell. A correspondent from the Louisville Herald, even a young freelancer for a magazine that would later become Wife. They packed the single cafe, scribbling down every rumor between cups of weak coffee. Federal agents posted at the property's edge refused to answer questions, citing public safety. What had burned, they said, was an isolated religious encampment. But locals knew isolation didn't make flames climb sky high or blue light erupt from the earth. For the first week, The investigation followed a predictable rhythm: interviews, measurements, endless paperwork. Yet each day something vital went missing. Evidence tags were mixed up. Photographs vanished from developing rooms. By the 10th day, the sheriff's own notes were replaced by a clean carbon copy stamped unreleased material. Federal interest. In truth, the sheriff had done what many sheriffs in poor counties did: asked for help from the Bureau of Mines to determine whether the fire had triggered a collapse. But once the federal men arrived, local authority ended at the first picket fence. People in town said the agents didn't just rope off the site, they buried it, literally. Trucks ferried out crates sealed in tar and stacked them in a warehouse that later, curiously, became the county maintenance garage. No one ever saw them again, thought Sheriff Amos Trenton, the last local official to walk the burnt sanctuary, told his deputy afterward. And that wasn't coal that burned. It was something I can't write down without losing my badge. When a Courier reporter pressed him, he claimed federal jurisdiction, shrugged, and retreated into silence. By the year's end, he'd resigned. Meanwhile, journalists met dead ends everywhere. Photographs sent for development returned as blank frames. A newspaper in Nashville ran an expose titled "The Fire That Washington Forgot." It was pulled within 48 hours. Another journalist, Helen Foster, interviewed survivors and found herself followed for weeks by unmarked trucks before she went missing on a drive to Kentucky. Her car was discovered 2 months later, empty, the camera case inside clean and dry despite rain dot. It wasn't only the outsiders who went quiet. Survivors began receiving anonymous payments, sizable sums, for people who claimed to have no employment. One of them, a woman named Lydia Cates, moved to Cincinnati and refused interviews until her death in 1983. In her will, she left a single note, folded inside a Bible. "They told me not to speak because the mountain was not done." Every whisper pointed toward interference from men with influence, investors, politicians, clergy who'd hidden their connections to Crow's congregation. While the cult outwardly scorned the government, its leader had quietly traded favors with coal brokers and district officials. In exchange for keeping the peace on the ridge, the group was left alone. Some believed Crow's compound sat atop untapped coal seams, coveted by companies unwilling to buy land that might draw scrutiny. An unnamed clerk later claimed 3 deeds from the area were signed over to a front company mere weeks before the fire. And the federal presence? Convenient. They could frame the operation as environmental containment while safeguarding hidden commercial interests. It was an Appalachian pattern as old as the mines themselves: faith, fear, and profit twisting around one another until no one could tell which was which dot by the time the reporters packed up and left. Official records contained a paltry 36 pages, firesite diagrams, casualty lists, and 2 autopsy reports noting death by asphyxiation. The rest were classified under the vague heading Potential Subterranean Hazard Assessment. To this day, those files remain sealed. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act yield the same answer: existing data compromised materials lost due to degradation. For decades, that explanation held. Locals stopped asking. The ridge grew over. The cult blurred into folklore. But silence is a poor guard, especially when curiosity becomes inheritance. In the late 1990s, a doctoral researcher from the University of West Virginia named Daniel Kerr began re-examining unsolved Appalachian tragedies. Hidden deep in the university archives, he stumbled across an out-of-place folder, misfiled under the 1942 flood relief program. Inside were 6 photographs, labeled simply, Briar Hollow Restricted. Kerr described them years later in a lecture few attended. The images, he said, weren't of the fire itself, but of excavation afterward men in hard hats lowering instruments into an open pit that glowed faintly, even under daylight. In one frame, 2 agents stood beside a slab etched with a spiral figure identical to Crow's symbol. This discovery sent Kerr digging further, cross-referencing requisition forms. He found signatures from both the Bureau of Mines and the War Department. Why the military? No record explained. When Kerr requested physical access to the negatives, he was told they never existed. The archivist who'd helped him left the job the next month. According to university rumor, their basement stacks were later reorganized, with several thousand documents pulped as duplicates. Those who have examined surviving fragments believe the suppression served multiple masters. Religious leaders worried the truth would shame their congregations. Businessmen wanted to secure mineral rights, untainted by talk of hauntings. And federal agencies, their reasons remained guessing games. Perhaps the residue found beneath the altar had properties they couldn't explain. Perhaps the mountain hid an instability with national implications. Or maybe, as the locals insist, they simply feared letting people believe that something ancient had awakened below their feet. At the center of every theory stands Crow, absent but unforgotten. His name disappears from public records after 1953. No death certificate, no grave. Yet years later, hikers claimed to find a cabin 20 miles north, stocked with canned goods and a single inscription carved into a beam. The voice still waits. Even now, Briar Hollow clings to its omerta. Elders refuse interviews. The current sheriff keeps a thin folder labeled "Crow Do Not Circulate." It holds nothing but a faded aerial photo of the ridge, a hand-drawn spiral inked in the margin. The investigation promised answers, but delivered a maze of missing files, replaced by legends too persistent to die. Every seeker who came hunting truth found themselves shadowed by something heavier than mere bureaucracy and inherited silence that feels as deliberate as it is protective. And somewhere, tucked in a university drawer that no one admits to maintaining, a file waits. A thin piece of film showing that impossible glow beneath the mountain aglow that, according to Kerr's account, seemed stronger every time he viewed the image. He said the emulsion warped every mountain keeps its ghosts, like the light itself refused to stay buried. The spirits don't just wander, they whisper. Decades after the fire, Crow's story became less a history than a haunting, half remembered and half invented. You can hear it in the way locals still lower their voices when talking about the old ridge, or in how even GPS signals fade near the overgrown road that once led to the compound. The past hasn't died here. It's simply changed shape. By the 1960s, a generation that never saw the gathered firsthand was already spinning new tales about them. Teenagers dared each other to climb the ridge at night and look for blue fire rising from the ground. Hunters claimed to see pale figures moving behind trees just beyond their flashlights. One coal surveyor told of stumbling onto a sinkhole and hearing a far-off humming, like wind through pipes, until he realized the air around him wasn't moving at all. He never returned to finish the job. Regional papers occasionally ran ghost spot features for Halloween that leaned on the folklore. The Curse of Crow's Hollow read one 1974 headline, illustrated with a crude sketch of the spiral symbol etched into a hillside. The article quoted an old miner who insisted that every 7 years, animals vanished from pens and wells turned sour. School teachers used the cult tale as a warning about blind faith, though they spoke in euphemism, the kindness that controls or the fire that blesses. But beneath the campfire gossip ran a deeper kind of silence, the quiet of families who had lost someone to the mountain and never got them back. Those weren't believers or thrill seekers. They were ordinary folks who remembered cousins, siblings, even parents who joined Crow just for a revival and never returned. For them, the legends felt like salt on a wound. One elderly woman, interviewed in the 1980s, looked at the reporter and said, "Y'all talk about ghosts. We talk about graves we couldn't fill. By the time cassette recorders were common, amateur investigators started visiting the ruins to collect evidence. They brought EMF meters, cameras, and microphones. Most returned with nothing but ticks and scratches except one. In 1989, a pair of college students recorded faint chanting on their tape, barely audible under crackling static. The rhythm repeated 3 times before the tape warped itself into silence. One of the students swore the voice spoke his name. When the recording was played back later, the last syllable of his name was missing, cut cleanly, as though edited by invisible hands. It circulated in local swap meets as the Crow tape, still traded among paranormal circles today. The folklore evolved with technology. Truck drivers swore that CB radios filled with faint sermons when they passed the ridge phrases about descending for the ascent, matching Crow's own teachings. Later, ham radio enthusiasts claimed to pick up long, unbroken tones, like someone striking a single note deep underground. Skeptics point out that the ridge's veins of iron and coal could reflect radio waves in odd ways. True believers nod politely and say, "Sure, the mountain talks back to whoever's listening." Even now, if you visit Briar Hollow's diner and mention Crow, you'll get different reactions depending on who's pouring your coffee. Some roll their eyes. Others stiffen and glance at the windows, making sure dusk hasn't settled in. One man, interviewed for a local podcast, said he was 7 when the fire happened. He leaned close to the microphone and whispered, "When the smoke cleared, the birds didn't come back for 3 summers. Not one sound up there. You tell me that's just a story." The contrast is stark on one side, a carnival of ghost tourism and YouTube thrill seekers. On the other, the aching truth of people who lived through real loss. The tailies keep shifting, as folklore always does, but within that invention lies a form of remembering. Legends let people speak of horror without staring it directly in the eye. To say the ridge is cursed is easier than saying your brother was buried in an unmarked grave. Scholars who study regional myths call it the afterlife of fear, when trauma becomes a shared superstition, passed down like a family secret. In Briar Hollow, the fear is still alive, worn as a kind of cultural armor. Outsiders chase chills and camera shots, but the residents know better. They still leave small piles of salt on the windowsills every spring. They still warn children not to whistle after dark. And when fog descends over the ridge and the air vibrates with that strange low hum, most of them just close their doors. As it turns out, doesn't stay buried, at least and pretend they don't hear the mountain murmuring back. The mountain may still guard its secrets, but every now and then, someone stubborn enough comes, along with a pick and a notebook, determined to pry them loose. For much of the late 20th century, the story of Elias Crow sat at the edge between folklore and rumor, too fantastic for historians, too well documented for ghost hunters. That changed in 2016, when investigative journalist Clara Breen arrived in Briar Hollow, chasing what she thought would be a short feature about America's forgotten cults. What she found instead was a rabbit hole leading straight into the hollow heart of Appalachia. Belief and the first real evidence that Crow's so-called revelations from beneath the mountain weren't entirely metaphorical. Breen began where others ended, the county archives. Decades of neglect had left most files brittle and half-legible, but tucked into a mislabeled folder under agricultural permits. 1951, she found a set of carbon copy letters, typewritten, addressed to the Bureau of Mines regional office. They bore no sender, only the notation "easy" at the bottom. The letters described continuing resonance, activity beneath Briar Hollow, and the need for containment until ascension is complete. Breen recognized phrases identical to those found in transcriptions of Crow's sermons stored online by folklore enthusiasts. Whatever these letters were, they blurred the moral lines between church and state, faith and science. Secrecy and survival. She traced the paper trail through public record requests, collecting fragments, government memos about noise disturbance readings, requisition slips for lead-lined containers, even a requisition for a containment structure built in 1951 near the old compound site. Someone, she realized, had known that Briar Hollow hid more than ashes. Breen's research gained momentum when she met Daniel Kerr, the same academic who had once uncovered the strange photos at the University of West Virginia. Kerr was older now, gray at the temples, wary. He told her he'd been warned off. They said the mountain's quiet for a reason, he muttered. Still, he handed her a drive containing scans of documents he'd saved before the archives were purged, sketches of coded phrases, fragmented diagrams of geometric designs labeled lithic conductor patterns. Crow's handwriting appeared in the margins beside the word harmony. The deeper Breen dug, the less the story resembled folklore, and the more it looked like an early case study in psychological manipulation. Crow had built a theology around resonance, literally tuning his followers to his frequency through repetition, deprivation, and sound. His chants from below weren't random. They followed mathematical patterns similar to those used in low-frequency experiments from that era. What he called divine vibration might have been a kind of self-induced trance. The voice of the mountain wasn't supernatural at all. It was human, despair amplified until it sounded holy. Breen saw disturbing parallels in modern life, charismatic figures drawing followers online, preaching self-reliance mixed with apocalypse, convincing believers the world outside was corrupt and dangerous. Different medium, same melody. In her notes, she scribbled, "The mountain has gone digital." Word of her upcoming documentary spread quietly through academic circles until, in early 2019, she received an anonymous email titled, "You're looking in the wrong place." Attached was a satellite image of Briar Hollow, showing sinkholes aligned in a near-perfect spiral, Crow's symbol etched into the land itself. A sender claimed that recent flooding had exposed lower chambers of the burned church. "If you want the truth," the final line read, "bring light, but not noise." The following month, Breen joined a small team of geologists exploring a newly opened fissure near the original compound. Inside, she found remnants of stone walls and collapsed tunnels, evidence of intentional excavation, not natural collapse. Then came the sealed door, a slab of metal backed with limestone, half buried but intact, stamped faintly with the letters EC. It had no visible hinges or lock, only a small vent the width of a hand. It took weeks of negotiation before local authorities allowed it to be opened under controlled conditions. When they finally breached the chamber, the air that escaped was dry, odorless, and heavy, as if held in place for decades. Inside lay rows of metal boxes stacked like filing drawers, their labels bleached to ghosts. Each contained inch-thick journals bound in leather. The first page of the first volume bore an inscription, "Letters from below," dictated by the voice through his servant Elias Crow. The contents defied easy summary. Some entries described mundane supply lists or devotional prayers, while others read like transcripts of conversations between Crow and something he called the breath beneath. One passage detailed an experiment in which followers were instructed to hum at specific frequencies until the stones themselves began to breathe. Crow recorded sensations of warmth, light, and voices shaping new limbs from the earth. Whether these were the ravings of a madman or results of crude sound experiments remains uncertain. Breen's footage captures her first reaction: no fear, only heartbreak. "He wasn't just a preacher," she said into the camera. "He was a man trying to manufacture meaning out of dust." And the dust listened. Her findings reignited debate across academic communities. Psychologists saw parallels to modern radicalization methods: isolation, rhythmic indoctrination, language loops reinforcing dependency. Sociologists pointed out that Crow's apocalyptic rhetoric mirrored conspiracy movements, festering in online spaces, crossing generations through fear. The mountain, they argued, had become a metaphor for any echo chamber that rewards obedience over truth. Then came the discovery that changed everything again. While cataloging the remaining boxes, a graduate student noticed a hairline seam in the chamber's rear wall. Beneath a layer of plaster lay another door, this time wooden and carved with a familiar spiral. Behind it, a second room, a cell of sorts. Dust-covered, undisturbed, containing a desk, a chair, and a pile of clothing so old it crumbled at touch. On the desk sat a lantern fused into solid glass and a single open notebook. The final entry, dated after the fire's supposed date, read, "The light is not dead, it just waits for ears willing to hear it again. No official explanation has been issued." The chamber is now under state custody, sealed pending safety evaluation. Rumors claim the air inside still vibrates faintly, like a distant chord holding its breath. For modern audiences, the story of Elias Crow feels both archaic and alarmingly current, a reminder that under isolation and fear, even the most rational people can start hearing voices in the noise. Truth seekers continue to chase his legacy, each one convinced they're close to decoding those letters, each one drawn a little deeper into the very echo that destroyed him. What's certain is this: the mountain keeps broadcasting, and we're still listening. Somewhere in those lost frequencies, maybe Crow really did leave a message, not from below, but ahead, warning that belief without balance will always burn until only the ash remembers. And perhaps, deep in that sealed room, the answer still hums beneath the silence, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. History, as it turns out, doesn't stay buried, at least not in Appalachia. The 70 years after the fire, Briar Hollow looks peaceful again, trees reclaiming the charred ridge, birdsong threading through the pines. To an outsider, it's just another quiet corner of Appalachian country. But for those whose roots run through these hills, peace has never come easily. The wound left by the gathered didn't vanish. It simply healed over unevenly, leaving the valley with a limp rather than a scar. Descendants of Crow's followers still live among their neighbors, though most don't admit it aloud. You can trace lineage only by careful listening. A last name murmured after church, a story trimmed of too many details. Some families deny connection entirely, insisting their kin were just helping build the church. Nothing more. Others acknowledge the truth, but reject the word cult, seeing their ancestors not as zealots, but as victims of hunger and hope. They were trying to survive, one granddaughter said quietly, and somebody promised them it meant something. That sense of caution colors everything. Faith remains strong here, but tempered steady, humble, suspicious of grandeur. Preachers visiting from outside rarely last long. The locals prefer plain worship, small prayers, no talk of prophecy. Crow cured us of spectacle. An old pastor once joked, though his eyes didn't join the laughter. The community learned the hard way that holiness shouts loudest when pride creeps in behind it. Generational distrust runs deeper than belief. Families who never joined the sect still carry unease toward those who did. Even after decades, marriages between the lines remain rare, as if the fire left an invisible border running through bloodlines. Children grow up hearing twin rumors warnings about both blind faith and inherited sin. Some move away rather than carry the weight of a name whispered sideways in grocery lines. Others stay, determined to prove the ridge no longer rules them. Yet healing does appear in quiet ways. Every summer, Volunteers clear brush from the overgrown cemetery where most of the victims were laid to rest. There are few headstones, just field rocks, their surfaces etched with faint spirals, carved by unknown hands. People leave wildflowers in jars of creek water beside them, without sermons or speeches. The gesture isn't reverence so much as weary respect, a promise to remember without reopening the grave. Younger residents, raised on both folklore and skepticism, find uneasy fascination in the story. At the local high school, students write essays debating whether Crow was prophet or con man, visionary or manipulator. Some organize service projects in his victim's memory, planting trees along trails that once led to the compound. Their teachers encourage discussion, but remind them that history, here, is still a neighbor's shadow. Study it, one teacher says, but don't summon it. Forgiveness remains the most elusive form of healing. The few churches that still stand in Briar Hollow hold annual prayer meetings for lost souls of the mountain, though the prayers aren't directed at Crow, they're for those who followed him, and for the families left behind. The mountains don't echo during those vigils, but they seem to listen. What endures above all is vigilance, a practical spirituality, wary of saviors and slogans. Ask most locals what they believe in now, and they'll say something like community, hard work, and not tempting the dark. The laughter that follows is short but warm. It's how people here reclaim dignity after fear, by turning the story that once defined them into a caution they can own. The ridge no longer glows at night, though hunters still claim to hear faint humming when the air turns cold. Maybe it's just wind through the mine shafts, maybe something older. Either way, Briar Hollow has learned to live with it, to let the silence stand without trying to fill it with sermons or science. But the mountain endures, patient as ever, holding both beauty and grief in the same breath. And the people beneath it endure too, not forgetting, not afraid, simply aware that every story carved into stone eventually becomes part of the earth it rests on. The mountains have long been teachers. They show us what endures and what collapses under its own weight. In Briar Hollow, the lesson came branded in flame, a reminder that faith, when stripped of compassion, can harden into control as merciless as winter stone. Elias Crow believed he was building a refuge. What he created was a mirror that reflected both the ache for meaning and the danger of finding it in the voice of one man. Isolation, whether physical or spiritual, sharpens hunger. Up here, where the horizon folds into itself, it's easy to imagine the world has forgotten you, and easier still to cling to anyone who swears they've heard God speak your name. But belief without empathy becomes its own kind of wilderness, one with no map and no dawn. Crow preached descent before ascent, promising salvation in the dark. The tragedy is how many followed, thinking they'd emerge in the light. Even now, standing on the ridge where the church once stood, you can feel the tension between beauty and sorrow. Ferns cover the blackened stones. The air smells of rain and iron. It's almost peaceful until the wind shifts and you catch an undertone, a faint vibration that might just be memory humming through the roots. No ghosts, no miracles, only the echo of voices that loved something fiercely enough to lose themselves to it. We like to think such devotion belongs to the past, but the line between faith and fear hasn't vanished. It's moved inside us. The same yearning that drew the gathered still hums through humanity today in movements, in messages, in the corners of the internet where certainty sells faster than truth. Crow's sermons promised protection from a chaotic world, and that promise hasn't aged a day. It's the old Appalachian melody reborn through new instruments. Follow, obey, fear nothing but the outsider. Maybe the warning Briar Hollow leaves us isn't about cults or creeds at all. Maybe it's about how easily light can be mistaken for warmth, how comfort lures us closer until the glow becomes a blaze. Faith should bind people together, but in the wrong hands, it binds them to silence. The people who live beneath this mountain have learned that lesson in their bones. They still sing hymns here, soft and slow, but they sing them with eyes open as the sun sets over the ridge. Shadows creep long through the holler, and every rustle in the trees sounds like a secret being folded back into the earth. The forest has reclaimed what the fire took roots threading through pews, moss sealing the stones of the old altar. Somewhere below, the tunnels shift with the settling ground, whispering, not with menace, but with memory. The mountain no longer needs to shout. It only hums low, steady, and patient, a reminder that belief without kindness burns, but belief tempered by compassion can outlast any storm. In the end, it isn't the fire or the fear that defines Briar Hollow. It's the quiet afterward, when the smoke lifts and what remains learns to breathe again.